The City of Ottawa honors the peoples and the lands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, and the City of Ottawa honors all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dom Ferland, the City of Ottawa's new Wildlife Resource Coordinator. It's a pleasure to welcome him to this webinar this evening. He has a brand new position at the city, and he brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to the city's natural systems branch within the climate change and resiliency unit. He is working on human-wildlife conflict resolution and is striving to advance strategies to prevent those conflicts in the first place, amongst other objectives. Dom started with the city in January of 2025, bringing with him years of related experience from the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and the National Capital Commission. He has a Master's of Science degree in Animal Ecology and Behavior and an appreciation of the natural riches found within Ottawa, within our city. We appreciate his expertise, and he has already proven to be a true asset for Ward 13 residents, providing them with valuable insights and knowledge related to wildlife in our ward. At this time, I'd like to turn things over to Dom, who will provide a detailed presentation.
Thank you, Councillor. Let me just share my presentation. Can someone confirm that you're seeing my presentation before I go ahead?
And I can see it.
Oh, okay, perfect. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on wildlife in Ward 13. Bonsoir tout le monde. Bienvenue sur ce webinaire au sujet de la faune du quartier 13. Councillor King did a very good job introducing me, so I won't spend too much time on that. I'm relatively new in my position, been in there 4 months, and my primary role within the city is to implement the wildlife strategy. So that goes from wildlife sensitive planning to preventing and managing issues with specific species. Namely, right now my focus is mostly on beaver and coyotes. And, the main goal of our wildlife strategy here at the city is to coexist with wildlife. And so a key part of that is to prevent conflict with wildlife, and public education is a very important aspect of prevention, so residents can make well-informed and wildlife-compatible decisions. Donc, mon rôle avec la ville, c'est l'implémentation de la stratégie de la faune, la planification qui est compatible avec la faune, la prévention et la gestion des problèmes avec des espèces spécifiques telles le castor et le coyote. Mais le but principal de notre stratégie de gestion de la faune, c'est de vivre en coexistence avec la faune. Et un aspect primaire de ça, c'est la prévention des conflits. Et pour ce faire, on veut mettre l'emphase sur l'éducation du public pour que les résidents de la ville d'Ottawa peuvent faire des décisions bien informées qui sont compatibles pour coexister avec la faune. Donc, c'est ça un peu le focus de notre présentation ce soir. So, for a quick summary of our presentation tonight, we're going to talk about our urban wildlife and why is it there and why does it exist. We're going to go a bit into what is conflict, what is coexistence, and the aspirational goals of our wildlife strategy. We're going to look at the high level and root causes of wildlife conflict, and then basic principles of wildlife conflict prevention. We're then going to go quickly over the legal framework, which are the responsibilities and constraints on what we can and can't do to resolve conflict. We're then going to talk about a few specific species that have been identified to me as of particular concern in your ward. And we're going to talk a bit about wildlife in distress. So those are orphaned or injured wildlife, what to do when you find them. Finally, we're going to go over a few resources that you guys can refer to when you have questions about wildlife or how to resolve certain issues in your life with wildlife on your property. And then we've had questions submitted ahead of this seminar that I'm going to go over, and then we can take further questions that you can submit right now. Donc, la présentation ce soir, on va commencer en parlant un peu pourquoi la faune urbaine existe, pourquoi elle est dans nos espaces urbains. On va aussi parler un peu c'est quoi les sources de conflits, c'est quoi les méthodes de prévention des conflits. On va parler ensuite du cadre légal, c'est quoi les responsabilités des différentes agences, mais aussi les responsabilités des propriétaires et aussi les contraintes légales qu'on a quand on doit gérer des conflits avec la faune. On va parler d'informations spécifiques à 3 espèces que vous voyez, le raton laveur, le dindon et le coyote. On parlait un peu de faune en détresse, donc quoi faire quand vous trouvez des jeunes, des bébés qui sont orphelins ou des animaux blessés. Je vais vous donner quelques ressources que vous pouvez consulter pour résoudre ou trouver des solutions aux problèmes que vous avez avec la faune de temps à autre ou la prévention des problèmes. Et ensuite, on a reçu plusieurs questions de votre part, puis je vais aussi prendre les questions que vous soumettez en ligne pendant la présentation. Donc, why is there urban wildlife? Well, so if we look at Ottawa, it's surrounded by a broad natural landscape. There's a lot of relatively undeveloped woodlands all around it. To the west, we have Algonquin Provincial Park. We have the Frontenac Arch. We have Gatineau Park and the Outaouais that are largely undeveloped. And, more to the east and the south, we have rural areas of farmland like Lees and Grenville, Prescott, Russell, Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry. So there's lots of habitat for wildlife all around the city and lots of opportunities for wildlife to move into the city. Donc, la ville d'Ottawa est intégrée dans un complexe naturel beaucoup plus grand. À l'ouest et au nord, on a le parc algonquin, on a le parc de la Gatineau, on a l'Outaouais, qui sont des grandes régions encore boisées d'où la faune peut venir, qui ne sont pas très développées. On a aussi des zones plus agricoles au sud et à l'est, Prescott, Russell, Stormont, Dundas et Glengarry. Donc, il y a beaucoup d'habitats pour la faune tout autour de la ville et il y a aussi beaucoup d'opportunités pour la ville pour les faune de se déplacer et rentrer en ville. Si on regarde plus à l'échelle de notre... why is there urban wildlife? So there's lots of interconnected natural areas also within Ottawa. The natural area of Ottawa would rank 25th out of 43 parks. If we looked at it... compared it to our federal national parks. It's got the largest publicly owned city green belt in the world. And all these green spaces are also connected with the Rideau, the Ottawa rivers, green space around smaller water courses and valleys, networks of parks, trails, green space, and linkages. So what we can conclude when we look at this overall picture of the city is that a lot of the wildlife we have is not all that urban. It lives in large urban green spaces or rural areas, but some of our wildlife is also much more urbanized, whether it's moving in and out of green spaces and into more urbanized areas or permanently established in our natural landscape. Donc, la région d'Ottawa comprend beaucoup d'espaces naturels interconnectés. On a, par exemple, la plus grande ceinture de verdure au monde, qui appartient à la Commission de la capitale nationale. Ces espaces verts sont connectés par les rivières Rideau et la rivière des Outaouais. Et on a aussi plusieurs plus petits cours d'eau et vallées qui sont des espaces naturels, et on a un réseau de sentiers et d'autres espaces verts qui les connectent. Beaucoup de la faune qu'on a, donc quand on regarde à cette échelle-là, n'est pas si urbaine en soi. Elle vit dans des espaces verts autour de la ville ou dans les régions rurales. Mais on a aussi beaucoup de faune qui vit beaucoup plus proche des régions des zones développées de la ville, soit qui rentrent et sortent des espaces verts ou qui vivent tout le temps dans des espaces plus développés. Donc, one of the other things that we want to consider when we're talking about wildlife and when we were discussing, coexistence with wildlife is that wildlife gets displaced by development. But what we got to consider as well, while this is true, is that many species actually benefit from the environment that humans create. So this is the word of the day. It's synanthropic species. So these are species that, if we observe their population distribution, we'll see denser populations of those species closer to denser human populations. So those species benefit from the environment created by humans. Sometimes it's the agriculture, it's the edge habitat that we create, or the lawns. So a lot of common urban wildlife, such as squirrels, rabbits, cardinals, robins, and even coyote and deer, are considered synanthropic species. Donc, quand on parle de la faune urbaine, on parle souvent de la faune qui se fait déplacer par les développements, mais ce qu'il faut aussi considérer, c'est qu'il y a beaucoup d'espèces qui bénéficient de l'environnement créé par les humains. On les appelle les espèces synanthropes. Donc, c'est des espèces qui bénéficient du développement puis de l'altération de l'environnement par l'être humain. Des fois, ils bénéficient de l'agriculture, des bordures créées par les ouvertures qu'on crée en coupant des arbres ou par les pelouses. Donc, ce qu'on observe avec ces populations-là, c'est que les populations de ces espèces-là, c'est que leurs populations sont plus denses, proches des populations humaines. Donc, il y a beaucoup d'espèces qu'on voit souvent en ville qu'on considère comme étant synanthropes, comme les écureuils, les lapins, les cardinals, les merles, mais aussi des espèces plus grandes, telles les coyotes et les chevreuils. So, we're going to talk now about conflict and coexistence and kind of how we try to think about it at the city. Well, the first thing is that conflict is costly to both humans and wildlife. So for humans, the cost, is going to be financial, material, the cost to repair or remove wildlife. We can also talk about agricultural loss. There's also the stress or the emotional cost of fear and frustration of dealing with wildlife. And there's also the loss of wildlife that we can have if we don't resolve conflicts and we have to remove wildlife. Can be a cost. But for humans, there's rarely harm involved in the conflict. The cost to wildlife is going to be loss of habitat and stress from the harassment, the capture, nutritional stress if wildlife starts keying in on one source of food and then that source of food gets removed. And not always, but oftentimes harm can be a cost to the wildlife from conflict, whether that's injury or death. So what we strive to is to live in respectful coexistence to avoid conflict with wildlife. And the mindset that we think is best to accomplish that goal is to think of human-wildlife conflict as a human responsibility. And while that's not exactly the case, wildlife does actively engage in conflict to an extent. We can only control our own actions as humans. And we know that wildlife responds in a fairly predictable way, and which we can understand. So what we would refer to as their nature. I used to do a lot of information on bears for the province, and what we used to tell people that didn't understand why things were happening with bears and they were having an issues, we would tell them bears are going to bear. Like, what are you going to do? Because we know the bear's going to do what the bear's going to do. And so within all this, we have an ethical responsibility to avoid unnecessary suffering of animals. So to avoid unnecessary suffering, we need to take measures to even prevent needing to resolve a conflict, because a lot of the cost of conflict is not visible physical harm to the wildlife. And so I use the pictures of the raccoon in the tree and the raccoons in the attic, the raccoons in the tree and the raccoon in the attic here to symbolize, to symbolize where we want to be. We want wildlife to be in an appropriate habitat, carrying out its life process in appropriate habitat, and not in a tree, not in an attic, and then I put the two traps so we have a life trap and we have a body snatching lethal trap there to just symbolize like that capture is definitely a cost and to wildlife, even if it's not lethal. And we have to, even though like on the surface it seems like something rather benign for the wildlife to remove it using a life trap, it's actually pretty costly from them. There's a stress from the capture, the loss of shelter. There's always the potential for injuries. So what we want to do is avoid having to take those sorts of measures altogether. Donc, les conflits ont un prix pour les humains et pour la faune. Pour les humains, il y a un prix financier, matériel ou en temps pour réparer ou enlever la faune. Il y a aussi, on peut parler des pertes agricoles. Il y a aussi un prix d'un point de vue du stress émotionnel, de la peur, de la frustration qu'on peut vivre à cause de nos conflits avec la faune. Il y a aussi la perte de la faune, parce que si on a un conflit trop complexe, puis qu'on doit se débarrasser de la faune, eh bien, on la perd, puis c'est une perte pour nous. Mais rarement, les humains vont avoir à subir des conséquences physiques de leur conflit avec la faune. Tandis que pour la faune, les coûts du conflit sont la perte d'habitat, le stress, mais souvent aussi la faune va devoir souffrir du tort et soit des blessures ou la mort quand les conflits escaladent trop. Donc, notre but en tant qu'humain, puis ce qu'on essaie d'atteindre, c'est d'avoir une coexistence respectueuse avec la faune. Et pour ce faire, l'approche que l'on prend à la ville, c'est de voir les conflits avec humains-faune comme notre responsabilité, parce que nous autres, les humains, on peut contrôler nos actions. On sait comment la faune se comporte d'une façon assez prévisible. Et donc, ce qu'on appellerait leur nature, et on sait comment prévenir ces conflits. Donc, c'est à nous de prendre cette responsabilité. Finalement, j'ai mis l'image des ratons laveurs pour démontrer un peu les situations. On veut que les ratons laveurs puissent exister dans un endroit approprié, comme dans le trou dans l'arbre, et non comme dans notre grenier. Et aussi les images des trappes pour considérer que la souffrance qui découle des conflits entre les humains, c'est pas toujours aussi évident. Donc, tout le monde va pas voir la trappe mortelle qui écrase les animaux, qui les tue comme étant un gros problème, mais ça peut aussi être un assez grave problème pour un animal, puis un assez grave coup de se faire piéger dans un piège pour les relâcher en vie, mais ils perdent leur habitat, ils perdent leur maison, ils sont séparés de leur famille, ainsi de suite. Donc, il y a beaucoup de coups pour la faune à ce niveau. So what are the main causes of conflict from a broad standpoint? The primary needs for wildlife and for humans are food, water, and shelter and safety. And so, we basically compete and then come into conflict over those. And wildlife, as it goes through life, has to maximize the benefits and versus their energy costs and risks. We have to, remember that wild animals live on a very precarious energetic balance, and they have to make choices that seem very bold and risky for us to survive. But the reality for them is that, their next meal is not guaranteed, and so they have to do whatever it takes to survive out there. So the key to prevention really is to not making the option that leads to conflicts with us be a viable one. And a big cause of conflict to a main one is going to be habituation as well. So when an animal becomes habituated, food habituated or human habituated, they start being around places that are not appropriate around people, and they start displaying behaviors towards humans that are not appropriate, and that's a big source of conflict in itself. Donc, les causes principales des conflits avec les animaux, c'est que les animaux et les humains ont les mêmes besoins, la nourriture, l'eau et l'abri et la sécurité. Et donc, on va compétitionner et on va avoir des conflits pour des ressources. La faune doit maximiser les bénéfices dans sa vie de tous les jours contre les coûts et les énergétiques et le risque qu'elle prend pour toutes ces décisions. Puis, il faut se rappeler que les animaux sauvages vivent sur une balance énergétique très précaire. Alors, ils ont besoin ils doivent prendre des risques, ils sont prêts à faire des décisions pour s'assurer leur survie qui peuvent être un peu difficiles à comprendre d'emblée. Une autre source de conflit, il faut considérer aussi, c'est l'accoutumance. Donc, les animaux qui sont habitués soit à être nourris ou sont habitués à être près des humains vont se retrouver dans des endroits où démontrer des comportements qui deviennent très problématiques. So the keys, like just basic conflict prevention principles. The main one, and you're going to hear it tonight repeatedly, is don't feed wildlife. Feeding attracts wildlife near homes. It habituates it to humans. And then it can artificially draw in and maintain high populations that need shelter in areas that don't actually have the habitat to provide that shelter. And then what happens is they're going to try to take shelter within man-made structures, and that becomes a problem and a source of conflict. The next prevention measure is to secure and clean up food sources. So making food easily accessible is essentially the same as feeding. So secure food sources to not draw in wildlife near your home. And food can be garbage, compost, pet food, birdseed, fruit trees, gardens. You'll notice that a lot of the species we talk about have a diverse diet and they're omnivores. So basically, if it has calories in it, it's food to them. Another measure people can take is to select non-food plantings for their gardens. We're not talking about your vegetable garden, but your ornamental garden. We invite people to interpret wildlife around their gardens as just the site conditions. And, if there's just a plant if some species nearby is just going to strive to eat, and then maybe that's not the best planting to select in your garden. The other measure that we invite people to take is to secure and block entry points in your house. Vents, cracks, if there's damage to shingles, siding, those sorts of things, if you preemptively close them up and fix them, that can not invite wildlife in. Because as we said, again, if it's an easy option, they're going to go in. Follow speed limits. Source of conflict is for yourselves, damage to your vehicles. For wildlife, it's injury and death sometimes. So, if you follow speed limits, that's going to prevent that. And finally, the big thing about conflict prevention is it has to be a community effort, because it takes only a few people not implementing what we recommend here to really throw a wrench in the plans of the community and the efforts of the community. I've lived it personally. So that's something where, you share information with your neighbors, but you also maybe sometimes have to report people if there's really some egregious behaviors by residents. Donc, les mesures pour la prévention des conflits, les grands principes ici, c'est premièrement ne pas nourrir la faune. Vous allez m'entendre le dire répétitivement pendant ce webinaire. Quand on nourrit la faune, on l'invite à être près des maisons. on cause l'accoutumance aux humains et on attire et on peut maintenir des populations très élevées de faune autour des maisons qui ont ensuite besoin d'un abri et puis ils vont trouver les abris dans nos maisons. Donc, ça c'est très problématique. Ensuite, c'est de sécuriser et nettoyer les sources de nourriture. Donc, à cause que, essentiellement pour des raisons semblables, ne pas traiter les animaux de la faune comme des animaux de compagnie pour pas qu'ils s'habituent à être proches des humains. Aussi de choisir des plantes pour vos jardins qui ne sont pas de la nourriture pour la faune. On parle des jardins décoratifs. Si on fait juste un peu comme traiter la faune comme les conditions du site, s'il y a une plante que vous désirez avoir dans votre jardin, mais que la faune veut vraiment la manger, c'est peut-être pas une plante qui est très compatible pour où vous habitez. Sécuriser, bloquer les ouvertures donc, sur votre maison pour rendre l'accès le plus difficile possible. Donc, comme on a dit, la faune va être opportuniste, va faire les choix qui sont les plus faciles. Donc, si vous rendez l'option de rentrer dans votre maison pour habiter, plus difficile, ça risque de les empêcher de le faire. Respecter les limites de vitesse, une source de conflit habituelle avec la faune, c'est les collisions. Ça fait des dommages aux véhicules, ça fait des dommages à la faune, des blessures, la mort. Donc, en respectant la limite de vitesse, on réduit les risques que ça se produise. Puis, tout ça, c'est un effort communautaire parce que ça prend seulement quelques résidents dans votre quartier qui ne suivent pas vraiment ces mesures-là pour créer des problèmes à l'échelle du quartier. Donc, on vous encourage à partager l'information avec vos voisins, puis expliquer un peu les pourquoi de qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire, comme je vous explique ce soir. Puis, des fois, ça va peut-être prendre s'il y a des comportements vraiment problématiques, vous pouvez aussi les rapporter au service de bylaw. So now we're going to go over the legal framework for resolving issues with wildlife. So resolving, generally speaking, nuisance wildlife issues up to and including coyotes are the responsibility of the property owners. And so the really only exception to that if there's a threat to public safety, and that's going to be handled by the police. The city is responsible for wildlife on its properties. Relocate, what we often get requested when there's issues with wildlife in a neighborhood is to relocate the wildlife. And that's not a practical option. First off, it's illegal to release wildlife further than 1 kilometer than where it was caught. And that's from the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act, which is a provincial law that legislates most matters with wildlife. But there's also other reasons why we shouldn't be doing that. First of all, if wildlife is having problematic behaviors in your neighborhood, it's going to become a problem elsewhere. And relocation is really not as humane as perceived. The survival of wildlife that's relocated is pretty low. There's a lot of, they depend on their territory, on their home. There's a lot to live and survive. And so when they get relocated, there's a lot of negative social interactions. There's rodent mortality as they're trying to make it back to where they came from. So it's not actually as humane a solution as it's thought to be. So the law that legislates wildlife in Ontario is the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act, and the one that the section that legislates protection of property is Section 31. So under Section 31 of the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act, a property owner can harass, capture, or kill wildlife if it's damaging or about to damage their property. And to do that, they can do it themselves, or they can hire an agent to do so. So that would be your wildlife control company. A few things other bylaws to consider. our discharge of firearms bylaws in Ottawa. I think everyone here has common enough sense to not go shooting a shotgun or a rifle in your neighborhood. But the definition of firearms in Ottawa is pretty broad. So, you can't use BB guns, you can't use air guns. So just be mindful of your local those bylaws when if you're taking, if you want to handle that matter yourself. You also have to be mindful of cruelty to animals. So it's illegal in Canada to cause unnecessary suffering to animals. So, you got to be mindful of that if you try to resolve wildlife problems on your property. It's happened in the past that people have been charged with cruelty to animals for just causing unnecessary suffering during the process. And finally, the one bylaw that would apply to if someone's feeding wildlife in your neighborhood and it's becoming a problem and you're reporting it is our property maintenance bylaw. And that there's a section in that about property maintenance and standards, and that would be what applies. So the legal framework, le cadre légal, pardon, c'est la responsabilité du propriétaire de régler les problèmes avec la faune sur leur propriété. Donc, la ville est seulement vraiment responsable de la faune sur nos propriétés municipales. Quand on a des problèmes avec la faune dans un quartier, souvent ce que les résidents veulent qu'on fasse, c'est qu'on relocalise la faune, mais ce n'est pas une option pratique. Premièrement, c'est illégal de libérer la faune à plus d'1 kilomètre de son domicile où il a été attrapé en Ontario, selon la loi pour la protection de la faune. Les autres considérations qu'on a de toute façon, c'est que la faune, si on la relocalise, c'est déjà un problème où vous êtes, elle va devenir un problème ailleurs. Alors, c'est pas vraiment pratique de ce point-là. Puis la relocalisation est vraiment pas sans cruauté. Relocaliser un animal, c'est quelque chose qui est très, très stressant pour l'animal. Il y a beaucoup de... Les animaux sauvages sont très territoriaux. Il y a beaucoup d'interactions négatives. Le taux de survie des animaux qui est relocalisé est vraiment bas. Donc, la loi de la protection de la faune en Ontario, la section 31, sur la protection des biens, permet aux propriétaires d'une propriété de harceler, capturer ou tuer la faune si elle est en train d'endommager ou s'il a raison de croire qu'elle va endommager sa propriété. Le propriétaire peut aussi engager un représentant, donc ce serait un service de contrôle de la faune, dans ce cas-ci, pour s'occuper de la faune sur sa propriété. Prendre en compte qu'on a des lois sur les tirs d'armes à la ville d'Ottawa, donc vous ne pouvez pas utiliser une arme à feu dans plusieurs parties de la ville. Puis ça ne comprend pas seulement les fusils et les carabines, mais aussi ça peut comprendre les carabines à plomb, les carabines à air. Donc, rappelez-vous de ça si vous voulez prendre les choses en main vous autres mêmes. Il faut aussi avoir prendre compte des lois sur la cruauté envers les animaux du Code criminel du Canada, donc qui ne permet pas de faire vivre des souffrances non nécessaires à la faune dans le processus de résoudre des conflits. Puis la loi qui gère si quelqu'un nourrit la faune dans votre quartier, ça devient problématique, c'est la loi sur les entretiens des propriétés. All right, so now we're going to get into the species-specific part of the presentation. So we're going to take a look at raccoons, turkeys, and coyotes, because I've heard they're the species that cause maybe the most issues in your neighborhood. We'll just go over a bit of considerations for each of those species. So raccoons, they're very common around people. They're drawn to people because they recognize the opportunity for food. They're omnivorous. They take advantage of whatever opportunity for food they encounter. They like to den in cavities. In nature, that's going to be primarily large hollow trees, but in urban environments, that can be attics, chimneys, become inviting. They get into a state of torpor in winter, so you're not going to see them a lot in winter. But once temperatures get above freezing, they might get out and go for a little bit of a walk and look for food. So it's not really truly hibernation, and their young are born in April and May. Donc, le raton laveur est très commun autour des gens. Ils sont attirés par les maisons parce qu'ils reconnaissent l'opportunité de trouver de la nourriture. Ce sont des omnivores, donc ils peuvent prendre avantage d'à peu près n'importe quelle opportunité d'obtenir la nourriture qu'ils trouvent. Ils vivent normalement dans des cavités qui seraient dans des arbres matures, mais dans les environnements urbains, ils peuvent facilement s'installer dans un grenier ou une cheminée. En hiver, ils vont dans un état de torpeur qu'on appelle, donc ils vont dormir pour des longues périodes quand la température est très froide, mais ils peuvent se réveiller, sortir, aller trouver un peu de nourriture quand les températures montent au-dessus du point de congélation. Donc, ce ne sont pas des vrais hibernateurs et leurs petits naissent en avril et mai. Les ratons, raccoons are very smart and creative, and I would even describe them as problem solvers. As much as I've told you, like that, we need to see what a life conflict responsibility upon us as people. I think in the case of raccoons, that can be, a bit of a harder attitude to take sometimes because they have a bit of a proactive way of finding conflict more so than other wildlife. They have great dexterity. Their hands, they don't have opposable thumbs, despite what some people would tell you, but they can use both hands to do some very fine manipulation. Their hands are highly tactile, and they're also more sensitive than when they wet them. One concern with raccoons also is diseases. Rabies is not present in Eastern Ontario, and often like raccoons get reported if they're behaving oddly to have rabies, but there hasn't been rabies found in raccoons, and there hasn't been raccoon strain rabies, which is not the same thing. It's a strain of rabies that can be in different species, but it's raccoon strain found. So it hasn't been found in raccoons, and their strain has not been found in Eastern Ontario. There's a lot of vaccination efforts going on by the province at the border, and there hasn't been a case in years. Another disease that's pretty common in raccoon is canine distemper, and a lot of its symptomology is similar to rabies. So the animals are going to kind of wander around confused, and so that's fairly common, and that's what people encounter sometimes in the spring particularly. And finally, raccoon roundworm, which is a parasite that travels in their feces, and that's fairly contagious, is a concern when dealing with raccoons. Donc, les ratons laveurs sont très intelligents, sont créatifs et ils résoudent les problèmes. Ils ont une grande dextérité. Ils n'ont pas 2 pouces qui s'opposent, mais avec leurs 2 pattes, ils peuvent atteindre des niveaux de dextérité presque comparables à l'être humain. Et ils sont porteurs de quelques maladies qui sont préoccupantes, la rage, mais la rage est absente dans l'Est ontarien. Il n'y a pas de rage dans les ratons laveurs et il n'y a pas aussi la rage des ratons laveurs, qui est une sorte de rage dans l'Est de l'Ontario. Par contre, les ratons laveurs transportent son vecteur de la maladie de Carré, qui est une maladie qui a certains symptômes similaires à la rage. Donc, des fois, quand on voit un raton laveur qui a l'air complètement perdu au printemps, c'est la maladie de Carré qui est moins dangereuse, mais quand même assez dangereuse pour l'homme. Et aussi, à prendre en considération, c'est l'ascaris du raton laveur, qui est un parasite qui est transmis par leurs fesses. Donc, il faut prendre des précautions quand il y a des fesses de ratons laveurs sur un site. So, conflicts with raccoons. Well, they're very opportunistic. So, And what they're very famous for is they make a mess with garbage, recycling, and compost bins. And I think all of us have seen the scenes in the middle picture there where there's just garbage thrown all over the place by a driveway. It's pretty classic suburban site. They also then in attic, chimneys, sheds, and other parts of buildings, but mostly those. And so that leads to property damage from their chewing, tearing, and also, if they're in anywhere for a period of time, there's going to be a lot of feces, and that's a very important disease vector, disease issue with the raccoon roundworm. Donc, les ratons laveurs sont des grands opportunistes, sont connus pour faire des dégâts avec des poubelles, le recyclage, le compost. Je pense qu'on a tous déjà vu la scène qui est dans la photo du milieu où on voit des poubelles qui ont été complètement déchirées et éparpillées sur le coin de la rue. Un autre des sources de conflits, c'est quand ils veulent créer des tanières dans des greniers, dans des cheminées, des cabanons. Puis, dans ces situations-là, ils vont faire beaucoup de dommages matériaux en rongeant, en déchirant et en laissant des grosses quantités de fesses. Et ça peut être une préoccupation avec les maladies. L'ascaris du raton laveur dont je viens de parler est assez contagieux. So conflict prevention with raccoons. Well, the first step is to never feed raccoons. If you feed them, they're going to come around and there's going to be more of them, and they're going to try to find a place to stay near your home, which could be within your home. The second step is to remove and secure any food source you have around. So food sources are going to be obviously garbage, but also pet food, fallen fruit. If you have an apple tree that's dropping a ton of apples in the fall, that's a great food source for a lot of things. And if you don't want those things around, you'll have to remove the food. Bird seed is also a source of food. It's important to inspect your home for signs of raccoon activity and secure report or repair potential entry points. So entry points can be the soffits, like the new metal, plastic and soffits and siding on houses, a raccoon can easily just tear off and enter your house. So, it's important to just inspect it regularly to see. A spot where raccoons really like to enter homes too is when there's a broken roof lines, and especially like in attached homes where the roof lines meets a soffit that's a spot where the raccoon's going to be able to stand on a solid footing and just really work the soffit and tear into it. So at least inspect those, but it might not be a bad idea if you have like a lot of raccoons in your neighborhood, just to secure those areas with hardware cloth or wire mesh to just prevent. So there's also vents around chimneys, around and anywhere if your house is older and there's starting to be some parts that have rotten wood, then that's an easy entry point for a raccoon. And so the final point is to just address potential entries into your home proactively. If you hear something in your attic, go investigate. If there's raccoons on your roof, they're likely looking to enter your home, or they're already in there. So go have a look. Raccoons don't have any reason to be sitting around on roofs other than to get into your house, unless there's really large trees in your neighborhood that they might be accessing that way. That's highly suspicious. At least go have a look. If you find something early on, it's going to be way less of a problem than if raccoons have been living in your attic for a month. Donc, la prévention des conflits avec les ratons laveurs, premièrement, ne jamais nourrir les ratons laveurs, ça les attire proche de vos maisons. Puis la chose suivante, c'est qu'ils vont peut-être vouloir vivre dans vos maisons. Sécuriser, nettoyer les sources de nourriture, particulièrement les poubelles, mais on parle aussi de la nourriture pour les animaux familiers, des fruits qui tombent des arbres fruitiers, les graines pour les oiseaux. Donc, si on les empêche d'avoir accès à ça, c'est une autre chose qui va les attirer proche des maisons. C'est aussi important d'inspecter la maison pour l'activité des ratons et aussi sécuriser, réparer les points d'entrée potentiels. Donc, les ratons vont particulièrement entrer sous la corniche du toit. Ils peuvent défaire les soffites puis rentrer. C'est assez facile pour eux de les détacher les nouveaux soffites en plastique. Donc, surtout que le toit rencontre un soffit, ça leur permet de vraiment travailler là-dessus, puis ils peuvent rentrer par là. Donc, c'est des points très importants à inspecter sur la maison. Les autres endroits qui sont importants à inspecter, on parle des bouches de ventilation, des cheminées, ou aussi n'importe où qu'il y a du bois un peu plus qui commence à vieillir, qui peut peut-être être un peu pourri. Ça vaut la peine d'inspecter. Puis aussi, c'est important d'adresser les entrées potentielles dans la maison proactivement. Donc, si vous entendez des sons dans votre grenier ou si vous voyez des ratons se tenir sur le toit, allez vérifier pour voir s'ils ne sont pas déjà rentrés. So garbage gets a special section with raccoons. Raccoons versus garbage. So I got a lot of questions about this, and it is kind of an arms race with raccoons sometimes. So I wanted to elaborate on this a bit. Here are the main things you can do to prevent issues with your garbage and raccoons. The first thing is to put all your food waste in your green bin and only in your green bin. That makes it that you're fighting the battle over one container and not 2, 3, 4. So it restricts the potential for conflict right there. Then rinse your food containers before recycling so you don't have food scraps in your recycling. Freeze your meat scraps, especially in the summer. They can get very smelly, and the smell itself is going to be attracting raccoons. Ideally, the best thing to do is to keep your garbage indoors until pickup day. So that can be in your garage, in a shed, or people, just build locking bins. That way raccoons don't have access to it. They're mostly nocturnal. So if you put it out the morning of, it really eliminates a lot of potential for problems. Some people can't do that. If you don't have a shed or a garage or a bin or whatnot, then you got to try different things to secure your garbage. So bungee cords, straps, chains, locks. Raccoons are very good at working on things. So you might a chain is a small investment, and what you're trying to do is to secure the lid of your garbage bin, but also prevent tipping, because what the green bins in Ottawa are fairly, high centered of gravity, and so the raccoons can tip them and they just end up smashing them to open them. So, you can secure the lid and also maybe secure the bin to a post, to something, so that they can't tip it. One thing I've seen people do is to put a bit of weight at the bottom of the bins to prevent the raccoons from tipping them. And that's a pretty good idea, but you got to be reasonable with that, because you got to, the collectors have to be able to pick it up. But a couple of bricks is maybe not a bad idea. Donc, les ratons laveurs contre les poubelles, ils se sont mérités leur propre slide. Mettre tous les déchets, donc les mesures à prendre, c'est de mettre tous les déchets alimentaires dans le bac vert. Comme ça, vous avez un seul contenant que les ratons vont vouloir, qui va intéresser les ratons, pardon. Ensuite, rincer les contenants de nourriture avant de les recycler. Donc, votre recyclage n'a pas de nourriture dedans, qui ne va pas attirer les ratons. Idéalement, ce qu'on devrait faire, c'est garder les ordures à l'intérieur jusqu'au jour de la collecte, dont les ratons n'ont pas vraiment le temps de s'y attaquer. Mais, donc ça peut être dans votre garage, dans votre cabanon, où il y a des gens qui construisent une boîte en bois qui barre pour leur poubelle. Tout ça, ça peut fonctionner. Mais je réalise qu'il y a certains gens qui n'ont pas accès à un cabanon, garage, etc. Donc, dans ce cas-là, il faut prendre des mesures pour empêcher avec des cordes élastiques, des courroies, des chaînes, des cadenas, pour empêcher pour sécuriser le couvercle, mais aussi pour empêcher les ratons de faire basculer le bac vert, parce que les bacs verts sont assez hauts, puis les ratons laveurs peuvent les faire basculer, puis éventuellement les briser pour les ouvrir. Une méthode que j'ai vue, c'est que certains gens mettent un petit peu de poids au fond de leur bac vert pour les empêcher d'être basculés aussi facilement. Donc, c'est 1 ou 2 briques, pas 100 livres de poids, parce que les gens qui travaillent à la collecte des ordures ne pourront pas les lever, mais ça peut aider aussi. So raccoons versus garbage, I think I've seen a lot of people that just always have their garbage strewn about by raccoons. And so I just have this quote from maybe the smartest man in history, and he might be the one that could resolve this issue once and for all, but he had better things to do, is insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Donc, la folie, c'est de faire toujours la même chose et de s'attendre à un résultat différent. So if you're having problems with raccoons and they're getting into your garbage and it's frustrating you, if you put out your garbage the same way next week, the same thing is going to happen. That's just, so try something different. And like just a lot of the advice I gave before, try some of those things and you're probably going to find a solution. But it can be frustrating and it can be an arms race. They are a very persistent and very crafty animal. So now we're coming to, raccoons do get into houses. So removing raccoons from a house. Raccoons are quite difficult to handle relative to its size. I worked with research staff at the province, and a lot of them worked on wolf research projects and then raccoon vaccination projects. And to a man, they all would tell you that pound for pound, a raccoon is a lot harder to handle than a wolf. Another consideration if you have a raccoon in your attic is that often babies are going to be present and they need their mother, and they can be trapped inside your house if you take the mother and you seal the house. And what can happen there is the babies will die of dehydration and starvation in your attic. So the humane thing to do is to get them out and with their mother. And, just the practical thing to do as well is to get them out, because you're going to end up with the smell from the carcass that will need to be cleaned up eventually. The other thing that you have to consider if you have raccoons in your attic is that you have a pretty significant biohazard due to their feces and the roundworm that we've discussed before. So what we strongly recommend, unless you have a lot of experience handling wildlife, because, people think they can handle this themselves because raccoons aren't that big, is to hire professional help. Just wrestling with a raccoon in your attic in the semi-darkness or in just the brightness of your headlight might not be a good idea. Donc, les ratons laveurs, retirer les ratons laveurs d'une maison. Les ratons laveurs sont difficiles à manipuler relativement à leur taille. J'ai travaillé avec des techniciens qui faisaient de la recherche pour la province, puis ils travaillaient sur des projets de recherche sur les loups et les ratons et la vaccination des ratons laveurs. Puis ils vous diraient tous que les ratons laveurs sont plus difficiles à manipuler qu'un loup. Donc, juste prendre ça en considération. Les bébés seront souvent présents dans votre maison. Ils ont besoin de leur mère. Puis si vous fermez l'entrée que la mère utilisait, vous laissez les bébés là, ils vont être pris dans la maison. Donc, la chose éthique à faire, c'est probablement de ne pas les laisser mourir dans votre maison de faim et de soif sans leur mère. Mais aussi, c'est la chose pratique à faire, parce que si vous avez des bébés morts dans votre grenier, ou peu importe, ou dans votre maison, vous allez avoir l'odeur, vous allez avoir un gros nettoyage à faire. Il faut aussi prendre en considération les biorisques dus aux fesses. Donc, encore une fois, l'ascaris du raton laveur va être présent probablement parce que les ratons laveurs vont laisser beaucoup de fesses dans votre grenier. Ça prend un gros nettoyage. Donc, la recommandation qu'on fait, c'est à moins que vous avez beaucoup d'expérience avec la faune, faites appel à un professionnel. So now we're going to move on to the wild turkeys. Wild turkeys, a bit of history on them. They were extirpated in Ontario starting in 1909. And then in 1984, the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters started reintroduction efforts. Following that, we've had a rapid population expansion in Ontario. Turkeys are considered a conservation success story. It's upheld by the conservation movement as a great collaboration effort across the continent to bring back a species from the brink. And nowadays, turkeys occupy a larger range than they historically did, mostly because of habitat modification. Wherever there's agriculture and there wasn't before, turkeys can persist. Donc, le dindon sauvage, un peu d'historique, ils sont disparus de l'Ontario à peu près en 1909. Il y a eu des efforts de réintroduction par le ministère des Ressources naturelles et la Fédération ontarienne des chasseurs et pêcheurs à partir de 1984. Suite à ça, il y a eu une expansion assez rapide des populations. C'est considéré comme un des grands succès du conservationnisme. Donc, il y a des efforts à l'échelle du continent pour rapporter une espèce qui était au bord de l'extinction. Puis il y a de la collaboration en plusieurs juridictions. Donc, c'est un grand exemple d'un succès de la conservation. Le dindon de nos jours occupe une aire de répartition plus grande qu'auparavant, principalement à cause que où il y a accès à l'agriculture, il peut exister ou qu'il n'existait pas. So wild turkey biology, they're a very large bird. The mature males are going to exceed 20 pounds, but they can fly. They're omnivorous, so especially in the fall, winter, the birds are going to focus more on a grain-based diet. If there's bird feeders around, you'll see that. But in the spring, the poult, once they hatch, they need protein to grow enough to survive their first winter. So what you'll notice usually is the flock of turkey is going to move away from human food sources at that time of the year, and the hens are going to disperse to areas where their young can access a good diet of bugs. They breed in the spring. That's when you're going to see the males all puffed up, gobbling. They're pretty loud, and they nest on the ground. And then they're going to flock up in the fall. So that's the seasonal pattern, is they hit really high numbers, the fall flocks, like they can be hundreds of birds together, and then they're going to all disperse in the spring. They're not colonial nesters. Donc, la biologie du dindon sauvage, c'est un très gros oiseau. Les mâles matures surpassent 20 livres, mais ils peuvent voler. Ils sont omnivores, donc ils se nourrissent beaucoup de grains pendant l'automne, l'hiver, mais une fois que les jeunes dindons sont nés au printemps, ils ont besoin d'une diète qui comprend des invertébrés, donc des insectes, pour grandir assez pour survivre leur premier hiver. Donc, les femelles vont se disperser sur le territoire à des endroits qui peuvent avoir accès à beaucoup d'invertébrés. La reproduction se fait au printemps, donc c'est la saison à laquelle vous allez voir les gros mâles qui sont tous gonflés puis qui font les gros gloussements. Puis ils vont nicher au sol, juste à même le sol. Ce qu'on remarque avec les saisons, au fil des saisons, c'est qu'il y a des gros regroupements en automne de dindons. Ça peut être des centaines de dindons qui vont se réunir ensemble pendant l'hiver, en automne pour l'hiver, puis une dispersion au printemps parce qu'ils ne nichent pas en colonie. So wild turkeys roost in trees overnight. They're fairly loyal to their roost sites, so they'll find sites that have nice mature trees to roost in, and they'll come back repeatedly to roost there. And they like open habitat, generally speaking, because their eyesight is their main means of defense. So they like to be able to see around them. So that's where they're going to spend most of their time, is where they can see. Donc, les dindons se juchent dans les arbres pour la nuit. Ils sont pas mal loyaux à leur site ils se juchent, ils vont revenir tous les soirs au même endroit pour s'envoler dans les arbres puis passer la nuit. Ils préfèrent les habitats ouverts parce que leur vue, c'est leur mécanisme leur meilleur moyen de défense, pardon. Alors, ils prennent avantage des espaces où ils sont ouverts, ils peuvent bien voir pour se sentir en sécurité. So the main conflicts we hear about with turkeys are traffic, mostly just that they're going to sit out on the road and not move out of the way. Damage to gardening and landscaping. So they're going to sometimes eat plants in your garden, but the turkeys also feed by just scratching the ground, so they can really mess up mulch and things like that. In areas that are near a roost where the birds are going to be present repeatedly overnight, there's issues with scat. There's just a large amount of scat that can be considered property damage. Where they roost as well, there can be a noise disturbance because the turkeys gobble very early in the morning and very loud. So that can be an issue for homeowners that have a roost right over their home. And we get complaints about aggressive behaviors, and those can be real and people perceive turkeys as being aggressive when they're not necessarily being really aggressive towards humans, but just like being, puffed up and impressive. Donc, les conflits les plus communs avec les dindons sauvages vont être des conflits avec les circulations, parce que souvent, ils vont juste se mettre dans le chemin puis pas vraiment se déplacer à l'arrivée des véhicules. Ils vont faire des dommages au jardin et au paysagement, soit qu'ils vont manger les plantes, mais aussi les dindons se nourrissent en grattant par terre et en cherchant la nourriture, donc ils peuvent vraiment faire des dégâts dans le paillis. Il y a aussi des problèmes des fois avec les fesses, les endroits où ils vont se jucher, ils vont être là souvent alors qu'il peut y avoir une concentration de fesses. Il y a aussi une perturbation sonore. Donc les cycles où ils se juchent, au matin, très tôt le matin, les mâles vont faire beaucoup de bruit. Ça peut déranger les propriétaires. Et aussi, on peut avoir des rapports de comportement agressif. Et ça peut être réel ou perçu parce que les dindons, quand ils sont en mode de parade, ils sont tous gonflés, ils peuvent apparaître très impressionnants et peut-être agressifs, mais ce n'est pas toujours le cas. So conflict prevention with turkeys. Again, don't feed the turkeys. If you don't want the turkeys near your home, don't feed them. Secure and clean up food sources. So the main food sources for turkeys near homes are going to be bird feeders. So if you don't want large birds, you might not want to feed birds at all, or really clean up so that there's no food accessible on the ground. In the case of turkeys, selecting non-food plantings in your ornamentals can be very helpful. And also just protecting flower beds and gardens. So turkeys don't have a sense of smell or anything. So they just kind of wander around until they find food. And if you just block off or don't make access easy to your gardens, they're probably not good. They don't really fly unless they're fleeing danger. So they're not going to fly into your garden, or they shouldn't at least. And so, if you just put a few barriers, it can really help. And around traffic, it's just to follow speed limits, but also, if you see turkeys on the road and they're not moving, you can slowly idle towards them and they will move out of the way. Like they won't just let your car run over them. They're very, very, very fast. So, once you get close, they'll scatter out of the way and make way for your car. Donc, la prévention des conflits avec les dindons. Premièrement, ne pas nourrir les dindons pour ne pas les attirer proches de vos maisons. Sécuriser et nettoyer les sources de nourriture. Principalement, on va parler des mangeoires pour oiseaux ici. Si vous ne voulez pas des gros oiseaux, puis il y a des dindons présents dans votre quartier, peut-être qu'il ne faudrait pas nourrir les oiseaux ou vraiment très bien nettoyer en dessous de vos mangeoires. On peut aussi choisir des plantes qui ne sont pas de la nourriture dans les jardins pour éviter qu'elles soient endommagées. Et on peut protéger les parterres de fleurs et les jardins seulement en faisant des petites barrières assez simples parce que les dindons n'ont pas un sens de l'odorat ou quoi que ce soit, donc ils se promènent un peu n'importe comment, puis ils trouvent la nourriture au hasard, puis là, ils reviennent plus tard. Mais s'il y a quelque chose qui les empêche de rentrer dans votre jardin en premier lieu, ils ne vont pas voler pour accéder à votre jardin, ils vont juste pas y aller. Ça devrait fonctionner. Aussi, pour respecter les limites de vitesse, et aussi, si les dindons vous bloquent le chemin, vous pouvez lentement progresser et avancer dans le groupe de dindons. Ils vont se tasser. C'est des animaux très, très rapides. Ils vont être capables de se tasser du chemin avant que vous les écrasiez. Deterring turkeys from your property. So if you have turkeys that are perching somewhere you really don't want them, leaving feces behind, and you just want them to leave, there's a few methods you can try. You just want to make them feel unwelcome on your property and make them choose to go into another spot. So you can use water, you can just shoot at them with your hose or trigger some sprinklers when they come around. You can use brooms or sticks, and don't go around beating turkeys, but you can use, a broom to push them or a stick to give them a poke. Often wildlife that's gotten a bit too human, habituated, when you remind them that you can touch them, that's all it takes to really, really scare them. So, you just use reasonable force if you're using a broom or a stick. You can let the dog out. Turkeys are really scared of dog. Even if your dog's not a world champion, they're probably going to scatter if you let it out. And you can just use umbrellas, garbage bags, that sort of thing to just walk at them and make yourself bigger and just scare them off. Most often these approaches will work. Donc, pour dissuader les dindons d'utiliser votre propriété, donc si les dindons se perchent en quelque part sur votre propriété, ils laissent des fesses, vous ne voulez pas qu'ils reviennent, vous ne voulez pas qu'ils s'habituent à cette place-là qui est vraiment pas pratique pour vous, il y a plusieurs choses que vous pouvez faire pour juste rendre l'endroit inconfortable. pouvez les arroser avec de l'eau, avec votre boîte d'arrosage ou juste déclencher les arroseurs. Vous pouvez utiliser un balai ou des bâtons pour... On ne veut pas que vous battiez les dindons, mais pour les pousser ou pour leur rappeler que vous pouvez faire contact avec eux. Des fois, ça peut vraiment leur faire peur. Les animaux qui sont un peu habitués, quand on leur rappelle que moi, je peux te toucher, des fois, ça vraiment leur rappelle qu'ils ont peur des êtres humains. Vous pouvez laisser vos chiens leur courir après, ça peut leur faire peur. Même si votre chien n'est pas très gros, les dindons ont très peur des chiens. Normalement, ça devrait fonctionner. Vous pouvez aussi utiliser des parapluies ou des sacs de poubelle juste pour vous faire paraître gros, marcher vers les dindons, leur faire peur. So here's our final species, is coyotes. So coyotes have had a pretty large range and population expansion in North America in the last 200 years. Main explanation for that is the change in the landscape, and the elimination of their competitors, the wolf, from a lot of areas. And so they're a predator with an omnivorous diet. So their diet's going to be mostly small rodents, a little bit of deer, but they can also eat fruit, grain, if that's available, and other things aren't. They avoid confrontation with humans and even encounters. There's a lot of coyotes around Ottawa. You guys don't see them all that much. It's because they're hiding. And most coyotes are under 40 pounds. They're not very big. They're leggier and they have thicker fur than most domestic dogs, so that can make them appear a bit larger than they are, but they're not actually very heavy. So between their ability to live under the radar and their omnivorous diet, they do thrive around humans. Le coyote a eu une expansion de sa distribution et de ses populations dans l'est de l'Amérique du Nord au cours des 200 dernières années. La raison principale pour ça, c'est l'élimination des loups, qui est un de son compétiteur principal, et aussi les modifications du paysage, de l'agriculture qui favorise. C'est un prédateur avec une diète omnivore. Ils consomment principalement des rongeurs. Ils peuvent consommer aussi des cerfs, mais ils vont aussi se nourrir de fruits, de graines, si c'est ça qui est disponible. Ils évitent vraiment les rencontres et les affrontements avec les humains. Il y a beaucoup de coyotes dans la ville d'Ottawa et on les voit très rarement. C'est à cause qu'ils nous évitent. La plupart des coyotes pèsent moins de 40 livres. Et il faut se rappeler, c'est un animal qui a des très longues pattes, qui a une fourrure très épaisse pour vivre à l'extérieur l'hiver. Donc, ils paraissent un peu plus gros qu'ils sont en réalité. So howling from coyotes is not a threat. They howl to reunite with their pack and to signal their presence on their territory. They don't do that after a kill. And when we hear coyotes howling, research has shown that we overestimate their numbers twofold. Coyotes breed in early to mid-February, and at that time of year, they have really increased visibility. So they're around more during daytime. The leaves are off, and the vegetation is tamped down by the snow at that time of year. There's a background of snow to see them, and they're also prone to using trails and roads that have been either cleared or tamped down by humans because it's easier to travel in the snow that way. So people see them a lot during that time of year. They den in early spring, and at that time they can have a very defensive behavior towards dogs. Coyotes see dogs as maybe even their own species, but at least as competitors, and that don't have the right behavioral cues, and so they're very defensive towards them. And so we have to be very mindful of that, especially around dens. And what they'll do also when they're denning is what we call escorting behavior. So if they see a potential danger, a person walking near their den, they're likely to sometimes just follow that person till they make sure they're far away from the den and everything's safe. So that's what we get reports of sometimes, is just, hey, a coyote followed me. Well, it was just making sure you're leaving, in many instances in the spring. Donc, le hurlement du coyote n'est pas une menace. C'est quelque chose qu'ils font pour se réunir avec leurs leurs congénères et marquer leur présence sur le territoire. Ils se reproduisent du début à la mi-février et il y a une grande augmentation de leur visibilité à ce temps-là de l'année. Il y a de la neige, il n'y a plus de feuilles, la végétation a été complètement écrasée par la neige. Les coyotes sortent plus pendant le jour, donc puis il y a un contraste très grand avec la neige, donc les gens les voient beaucoup plus facilement. Donc, on reçoit beaucoup plus de rapports à ce temps-là de l'année. Ils vont dans les tanières au début du printemps et à ce moment-là, ils vont avoir des comportements assez défensifs avec les chiens, à cause qu'ils voient les chiens comme des compétiteurs qui sont peut-être une menace pour leurs chiots. Donc, si les chiens approchent les tanières de coyotes, c'est là qu'on peut avoir des problèmes. Puis, ils vont escorter les passants. Donc, ce que les coyotes font, c'est que s'ils détectent quelque chose qui passe proche de leur tanière qui pourrait être un danger, ils vont juste suivre la personne pour s'assurer qu'elle quitte les lieux. So conflicts with coyotes. So dogs are considered a threat or competition for food, for territory, for pups, a threat to their puppies. So they're pretty defensive towards dogs, and we really have to be mindful of that. Another problem we have is when there's proximity to homes, parks, schools. Coyotes are not considered a threat to children, but people do think that when they see them around. And they can prey on smaller pets. There's a lot of conjecture with, when there's coyotes in an area, every cat that goes missing has been eaten by a coyote without, really any proof of it, but they can eat cats. Donc, les chiens sont perçus comme étant des compétiteurs pour les coyotes et une menace pour leur nourriture, leur territoire, leurs petits. Donc, les coyotes vont avoir des comportements défensifs envers les chiens. Il faut vraiment faire attention avec ça, spécialement pendant la période où ils ont des petits chiots. Un des problèmes qui nous est rapporté souvent, c'est la proximité aux maisons, parcs, aux écoles. Les coyotes sont vraiment généralement pas considérés comme étant un danger pour les enfants. Ça se produit essentiellement pas des attaques sur les enfants. Faut juste prendre certaines mesures, mais s'il y a un adulte présent, on n'a pas de problème là. L'autre problème qui nous est rapporté, c'est des prédations des animaux familiers de taille. On parle beaucoup des chats. Il y a beaucoup d'insinuations qui se font que tous les chats qui disparaissent quand il y a des coyotes présents sont en fait mangés par un coyote. Mais il n'y a aucun doute que les coyotes, des fois, peuvent attaquer et manger des chats. So conflict prevention with coyotes. Never feed coyotes. Again, it's going to keep them away from people. And a habituated food coyote is a major problem. When they start approaching people for food, and that can get more and more brazen, that becomes a very serious problem. Secure, remove food sources. So we don't want coyotes around homes. We want them in natural spaces. So if we remove food sources, that doesn't attract them near homes. Keep your pets under strict control. So as I mentioned, especially with the dogs, if your dogs are out and about and they run into coyotes, bad things can happen. The coyotes, especially during denning period, can really see your dog as a threat and attack them. Do not approach coyotes or their dens. That's really where they're going to be at they feel they're their most vulnerable and they're their most defensive. They're protecting their young, and that can lead to some problems. And don't let coyotes linger around homes. So generally, they're not going to be a problem. They're not going to be around homes. But, if coyotes do begin visiting near a house, just what we want people to implement is just to do a bit of aversion conditioning, which is just shouting, waving at them, throwing something at them, just scare them off, and they shouldn't linger if there's nothing else there for them. Donc, la prévention des conflits avec les coyotes. Ne jamais nourrir les coyotes, c'est la première chose à faire. Un coyote qui est habitué à être nourri par les êtres humains peut devenir très problématique et peut devenir de plus en plus effronté dans son approche vers les gens, et ça peut devenir un très gros problème. On veut aussi sécuriser, nettoyer les sources de nourriture autour des maisons pour que les coyotes n'y soient pas attirés. On veut garder les animaux familiers, particulièrement les chiens, sous un contrôle strict. Comme j'ai expliqué, les chiens et les coyotes, ça joue pas bien ensemble. On veut pas que vos chiens aient des interactions avec les coyotes quand vous n'êtes pas là dans les parcs. Ne pas s'approcher des coyotes ou de leur tanière. Encore une fois, les coyotes sont dans un état très défensif quand on s'approche de leur tanière. Ils se sentent très vulnérables. Ils sont pas dans la tanière très longtemps, mais quand ils sont dans leur tanière, ils ont des très petits avec des chiots très petits avec eux, donc ils peuvent être plus défensifs. Et si ça arrive, ne pas laisser les coyotes s'attarder près des maisons. Donc, s'il n'y a pas de raison autre que comme de la nourriture qui les attire près de vos maisons, mais ici présents, encouragez-les à partir. On appelle ça l'aversion en leur faisant du bruit, en leur criant après, peut-être lancer un truc, leur faire peur, puis juste pas les laisser s'habituer à un endroit si inapproprié. So, encounters with coyotes. Normal encounters with coyotes are innocuous. I've worked outside most of my life, and I've never had a bad encounter with a coyote. You'll notice a coyote slink through the back of a park or observe you from a distance or just like darting away from you. That's what normally you're going to experience if you run into a coyote. So what I'm saying below really applies to a close encounter, especially if a coyote kind of starts approaching you. So what you want to do is just stand tall, wave your arms, shout at it, pick up your kids or pets. What you don't want to do is just not turn your back and run. Most animals, including coyotes, have a natural reflex to chase. So just don't run away from them. Back away slowly. And there shouldn't be a problem. Most coyotes will just, even if they linger around a bit, they're just curious, and they identify mostly by smell. So if they can't smell you, they might linger a bit longer, but it's not, there's outward aggression towards people is very, very rare. Donc, si vous avez une rencontre avec un coyote, normalement, les rencontres se font sans problème. J'ai travaillé à l'extérieur toute ma vie, puis j'ai jamais eu une rencontre déplaisante avec un coyote. Normalement, vous allez les voir passer rapidement au fond du parc ou vous observer à une distance ou partir à la course en vous voyant. Mais si un coyote s'approche de vous ou part pas, ce qu'on doit faire, c'est se tenir droit, agiter les bras, crier, ramasser les enfants et les animaux dans vos bras, mais aussi, surtout, ne pas tourner le dos ou courir. Tous les animaux ont comme un réflexe de poursuite. Donc, si vous courez, ça peut les encourager à vous courir après. Vous démontrez un peu de la vulnérabilité en même temps. Puis tout simplement reculer puis quitter les lieux si un coyote fait ça. Si vous avez... vous pouvez rapporter... you can report your encounters to 311. Especially, more closer encounters where the coyote is not leaving. We definitely appreciate to know about them. We now have a service agreement with Coyote Watch Canada, so they're going to provide services for education, prevention, inspection, and enforcement support in the city. So we might have them reach out to you and ask about what the encounter was and see if, because we just want to know if there's beginning to be problems in an area of the city, troublesome behaviors, so we can address them proactively rather than reactively. And if ever there's an immediate danger to humans from a coyote, what you have to do, the mandate for public safety is with Ottawa Police Services, so call 911. Donc, vous pouvez rapporter les rencontres avec les coyotes, surtout si des rencontres où le coyote vous approche ou ne quitte pas, au 311. Ça nous permet de faire un peu un suivi sur les situations qui sont un peu plus troublantes. On a un fournisseur de services à la ville depuis récemment, Coyote Watch Canada. Donc, il pourrait vous contacter pour faire de l'éducation, de la prévention, mais aussi pour faire un petit peu une enquête, pour qu'on puisse comprendre qu'est-ce qui se passe dans certains lieux, puis qu'on puisse prendre une approche plus proactive s'il y a des problèmes qui commencent à se développer avec les coyotes à certains endroits. En tout temps, s'il y a un danger immédiat aux humains, c'est le mandat de la police de s'en occuper, donc appelez le 911. As far as 911, like exercise some judgment, for danger, because it's got to be something really dangerous to, trigger a 911 response. Oh, all right. Finally, just a quick overview on small mammals. A lot of the issues with small mammals are going to be somewhat similar to raccoons, but just less intense. They're going to do dens in homes and under structures and some property damage. Again, never field wildlife and secure remove all the food around to not attract them near your property. You can block access to spaces underneath structures. So that can be with stone, with some hardware cloth, skirting around decks. Just don't make it easy to get under there. Secure entry points. With smaller wildlife, it's even, it takes less for them to get into your house. So be mindful of that. And so rats technically are not an invasive species, are not a wildlife, sorry. They are an invasive species. They're not considered wildlife. So there's a rat mitigation working group in the city because it requires collective efforts from multiple departments. I'm not part of that group, but I think a lot of the conflict prevention measures that you would implement for other small wildlife would work for rats as well. So wildlife in distress. So we're talking about injured or orphaned wildlife. So first thing you need to know, it's illegal for the public to keep wildlife in captivity. You have to be a wildlife custodian authorized by the Ministry of Natural Resources to do so. So keep wildlife wild. Only rescue wildlife under specific circumstances. We're going to go over them a bit later. Do not feed or offer water to distressed wildlife. That most often requires specialized equipment. There's a risk of aspiration, especially with small babies into their lungs. That can cause a lot of complications. Sometimes wildlife has experienced trauma, or if they've been starving, dehydrated, they have a metabolic shutdown. They're not ready to take in food, so that can cause more harm than good. And some foods are just inappropriate and digestible to wildlife. So don't feed or water wildlife until you've talked to a rehabber. Please be mindful that wildlife rehabbers are volunteer-run organizations. They have limited capacity to take your call, to take in wildlife. They're doing their best. Be patient with them. They're really doing their best. Bring wildlife to a rehabber or the Humane Society yourself. They don't use, as a norm, do pick-up themselves, or you can call 311 for pickups. Donc, il est illégal pour le public de garder la faune en captivité. Garder la faune à l'état sauvage et porter des secours seulement que dans certaines circonstances. On va élaborer là-dessus un peu plus ensuite. Ne pas nourrir ou offrir de l'eau à la faune en détresse. Souvent, il y a des risques qui aspirent dans leurs poumons. Ça prend de l'équipement spécialisé. S'il y a des blessures, la déshydratation, ça peut faire plus de mal que de bien. Puis il y a certaines nourritures qui ne peuvent pas être digérées par la faune. Les réhabilitateurs de la faune sont des organismes gérés par des bénévoles, donc ils ont des capacités limitées à répondre au téléphone et de vous aider, mais ils font de leur mieux. Donc, comprenez ça et démontrez de la patience quand vous demandez leur service. Vous devrez apporter les animaux aux réhabilitateurs ou à la Société pour la protection d'animaux d'Ottawa, soit vous-même, ou appeler le 311 pour la prise en main. Oh, I'm going long, eh? 5 minutes. So wildlife babies. The first thing we have to be really mindful of is that it's normal for many species to leave their young. Deer, when the first few weeks when they have a fawn, are going to leave it behind for hours and hours on end usually in a hay field, and come back and nurse it and come back. So it's normal for the baby to be alone at length. Rabbits, it's even more extreme. They're going to leave their babies. They're going to keep rabbits, they breed like rabbits, and that's why we talk about that, but they don't really take their babies too seriously. They'll just leave them somewhere and come back to nurse them. And as soon as the babies are mobile, they just leave and they never see their parents again. So if you find baby rabbits in your garden, like that's where their mom left them, and it's coming back most likely, but there's not extensive parental care in rabbits. Birds, often when the birds fledge initially, they don't fly so well. They're going to be on the ground. If you see a baby bird walking around that's got feathers, that's got its eyes open, its parents are coming back and forth carrying food to it. It's going to be fine. So generally speaking, the best situation for babies is to remain in the wild with their parents. Donc, plusieurs espèces laissent leurs petits seuls. Les cerfs vont laisser leurs petits seuls pendant des heures dans des champs de foin, puis ils vont revenir 1 ou 2 fois par jour leur donner du lait. Les lapins, c'est encore plus le cas. Ils vont laisser leur bébé à peu près n'importe où, revenir leur donner du lait quelques fois par jour. Et dès que les petits peuvent marcher, ils sont à leur propre compte, ils partent, puis ils ne voient plus jamais leurs parents. Les oiseaux, quand les oiseaux sortent du nid, les parents, souvent, ils ne vont pas être capables exactement de voler comme il faut, mais s'ils peuvent juste marcher, les parents vont venir leur apporter de la nourriture. Donc, la meilleure situation pour les bébés, c'est de rester à l'état sauvage avec leurs parents. So the main signs that babies need rescuing, if they're dead adults nearby, if they appear friendly, vocalizing they're following you or your pets, that's a sign. If they've been handled and damaged by a cat or dog, or if they appear unwell, so they have injuries, they're weak, they're not responsive, that sort of thing. In that case, contact a wildlife rehabber. These are the main rehabbers in the Ottawa area: Rideau Valley Wildlife Sanctuary, Holly's Haven Wildlife Rescue, Ottawa Valley Wild Bird Care Center, specialized in birds, and Caitlin's Critters. So those are the main organizations to contact. Indication qu'un bébé a besoin d'un secours: s'il est à proximité d'un adulte mort, s'il semble docile, s'il fait des sons, s'il vous suit ou il suit vos animaux de compagnie, c'est pas des comportements normaux. S'il a été manié par un chat ou un chien, ou s'il est indisposé de toute façon, qu'il est blessé, qu'il montre des signes d'être malade, il est faible, dans ce cas-là, contactez 311 ou un réhabilitateur de la faune autorisé. Les organismes suivants: Rideau Valley Wildlife Sanctuary, Holly's Haven Wildlife Rescue, Ottawa Valley Wild Bird Care Center pour les oiseaux, et Caitlin's Critters sont ceux qui œuvrent à Ottawa. Injured or sick wildlife. So the first thing we have to understand is that sickness and injuries are part of life for wildlife. So if wildlife is mobile enough, if you can't, corral it yourself easily, you should leave it be. Do not handle wildlife yourself, adult wildlife, and do not feed it or offer water. Call 311 for pickup, or bring to a rehabber or the Ottawa Humane Society yourself. So what's recommended is, you just corral an animal in a corner, or to not handle it, or if you can slowly corral it into a box or contain it in a corner, but don't try to handle it yourself. Animals will really struggle if you try to catch them, and if you don't have experience doing it, there's a pretty significant risk that you'll get hurt or you'll hurt them as they struggle. Donc, la maladie et les blessures font partie de la vie pour les animaux. Si leur mobilité est suffisante, que c'est difficile de les restreindre puis les surveiller pendant que vous attendez pour de l'aide, laissez-les aller. Ne manipulez pas les animaux vous-même. Si vous êtes capable de les guider dans une boîte ou de les garder un petit peu à l'écart dans un coin, ça peut être fait. Mais les animaux, si vous essayez de les manipuler, vont vraiment se débattre, puis il y a des risques qu'ils vous blessent, qu'ils se blessent. Donc, n'essayez pas ça si vous n'avez pas d'expérience. Ne les nourrissez pas ou leur offrir de l'eau, puis contactez le 311 ou un réhabilitateur de la faune autorisé dans ces situations-là. So that pretty much wraps it up. Sorry, I'm going a bit long. Both languages makes it very long. There's a lot of resources for residents of Ottawa. For a lot more information, I kind of glanced on a bunch of topics tonight. There's our website that has a lot of info on routine wildlife issues. Ottawa Carleton Wildlife Center, Holly's Haven, Rideau Valley Wildlife Sanctuary all have great information on wildlife issues and how to resolve them in a wildlife-friendly way. The Ottawa Valley Wild Bird Care Center has very good info specific to birds. Coyote Watch Canada has very good species, not only on coyotes, but canids, so foxes and even wolves. So their website is a great resource. The Ontario Provincial website has information on wildlife, but especially for bears, they have the Bearwise program. So they have a lot of information on bears, and they have a bear reporting line. So your questions. So these are questions that were submitted in advance. I'm happy to take more afterwards. I'm going to go over them a bit lightning round style. So bear with me. So can we consider creating a bylaw to request that solar lights have timers to be turned off at 11 p.m. as constant lighting disturbs normal natural processes? So bylaw is not my purview. You would probably have to bring that sort of item to council. My opinion on this is not the city's opinion, but solar lights likely don't have a very large scale effect. If they're the right lights I'm thinking of, they are pretty weak. And I think solar lighting around homes probably and guarded is probably more of a desirable deterrent effect that can be beneficial more than anything to keep wildlife out of, right around homes. So I'm not sure that would be beneficial. That's just my opinion. So how can we better support red fox in our communities where we would like to foster wildlife and biodiversity? Well, so if there's wild fox in your community, there's probably a good prey base. There's probably habitat present for them to shelter. So I think really what you need to do is just foster coexistence. So, conflict prevention around the home to facilitate coexistence by not feeding them, removing, food sources and you probably want to take measures to just prevent them denning in inappropriate spots. If you don't know, fox really stink. If they den under their deck, it's almost like having a skunk. Not pleasant. So yeah, take measures for that so people can coexist that way. Obey leash bylaws, so that gives them a chance to have, in green space, a quiet place to den and not be harassed by dogs, and obey speed limits, because the one thing that will, ruin a good fox situation is an encounter with the car. So who's responsible for what species and on whose land? I think I sort of mentioned that, but basically who owns the land is responsible for wildlife on their land. So the city is responsible for wildlife on city properties. The NCC is responsible for wildlife on their properties. There's other federal entities in the capital region that are going to be responsible for their own lands, and private property owners are responsible for their lands. So the one exception to this is if there's an emergency involving a large mammal in the city that can potentially be a threat to public safety. So recognizing that residents are not equipped to handle that themselves. So that's going to be taken over by us at the city and the Ottawa Police Service. And the National Capital Commission is our service provider for immobilizing and relocating wildlife in extreme cases, really. And the Ministry of Natural Resources, so the province, can also assist us in those instances if requested by police. So that applies to the outskirts of the city, provincial highways, also if the NCC is unavailable or needs extra support. What is the city doing about the increasing number of deer on roads? So that's not a problem I'm really aware of, across the city. First off, the city doesn't manage deer numbers. That's provincial mandate, managing deer numbers through hunting seasons. We don't do that. And the MNR numbers don't show a major increase in deer numbers around Ottawa. So I'm not sure what the problem that the increase in deer numbers is really. What we do is we have an awareness campaign that speeding costs you dearly. It's even won awards. So just a focus on safe driving, abiding speed limit, and how to react to wildlife on roads. So that's, to have better, safer driving around where there are deer. If you're hoping for signage regarding the speed limit or deer crossing side, that would be the Ministry of Transportation of Ontario on highways, and that would be the city on local roads. There's the email SRO at Ottawa for safer roads at Ottawa. If you really have a a specific spot you think, hey, like there's deer crossing the road there, it's something bad's going to happen. That's the email to contact, to my best understanding, or you can also take it up with your councillor. What do residents do when encountering a female turkey with young? There's not really much to do. Just leave them space, give them alone, and just, try not to separate the hen from her poult. If they do get separated, the poult and the hen usually are able to reunite, but it's not ideal. And the poult, they'll look for their mom. They do what they call kikiing, which is a very loud whistling call, and they're pretty vulnerable to predators while they're doing that. They're making themselves very detectable, but just give them their space. What do residents do if they find a turkey nest? Just don't disturb it. Don't bring attention to it, I would say. The exception to that is if the nest is, under threat from foot traffic, maintenance work, construction, etc., then at that point you probably need to inform and work with, the people that are owning that spot or operating on that area, and inform them of it, take measures to maybe flag off the nest and stay out of the area for the time the turkey's nesting. Can you tell us more about the city's wildlife construction protocol? I haven't really delved into the construction protocol a lot so far, but its main objective is to reduce direct impacts during construction, but also providing wildlife proofing measures for the neighborhood once it's built. So it's a bunch of best management practices relating to wildlife during construction. If you want more information, you can probably contact us directly with more specific questions, and we can provide you a bit more specific answer regarding the construction protocol. How about letting my cat of any size roam outside at night? So I don't know from what perspective that's being asked. As we mentioned, there are predators that can harm your cats, like coyotes, if you're really just letting it roam outside. And, there's all sorts of other threats like vehicles. And so I guess that's one thing to consider. Also, your cat, while it's outside, can kill and injure small wildlife, whether that's birds, small mammals, bats. I know I've heard people say that, I let my cat out at night, it can't get birds. Well, night is really, really short during the summer than when most birds are around. So unless you're waking up at 3 a.m. to bring your cat in, it's going to run into plenty of birds to do a lot of damage. So, letting your cat outside probably doesn't fit into the respectful coexistence ideal that we've talked about, so that's not something I can recommend. If I see a deer, coyote, fox, bear, moose, what do I do? Who do I call? Well, that's a broad question. So first off, lucky you. Enjoy and cherish the sighting. So if it's just a deer, give it space, observe it from a respectful distance. If it's a coyote or fox, you can report it to 311. If it's a bear, a moose, a deer, they're not normally a threat to public safety. If they have a way to retreat to green space, so there's not necessarily a need to call anyone. My opinion on this is don't bring attention to it with large mammals near the city. Most often the crowd is the problem. So that's one thing you want to maybe consider. So if a moose and deer or bear is well within a developed area and there's no really safe way out that you can see without running into traffic, and it's daytime, you probably do want to call the police. Police with our bylaw services, they can make a decision to address the situation. The thing they're going to probably be most mindful of is traffic safety. And so having been involved in these operations before, often what we need to manage the most and why the police needs to be there the most is to manage people more so than in the animal. Because, if an animal remains calm, even if it's somewhat in the city, it can make its way out without too much trouble. But once, people start crowding in and it starts panicking, that's where, it can, all sorts of stuff can happen. So, we just want to give it a chance to make its way out. And, often police is just required to protect people from themselves. To be honest, just not getting too close to an animal and cornering it and that sort of thing. So it's a good idea to, at that point, probably call 911. Do deer avoiders, those small white gizmos that can be attached to the front of a bumper, work? My understanding is that they don't. There's even been research on it from the University of Georgia that showed that those things don't alter deer behavior to prevent deer collisions. You got to remember, deer have really good hearing. They hear your car coming either way, so that doesn't really change that. Squirrels, gray and red, why are there so many? Well, squirrels are rodents and they're prolific and they can have really high populations and good habitat. So in an urban area that provides really nice, large, mature trees that produce mast and good nesting sites and probably artificial food from bird feeders and low predator densities, you can have a lot of squirrels. How to stop raccoons from climbing onto your roof and pooping on your balcony? So we talked a bit about this before, but if you have a raccoon on your roof, check your house, talk to your neighbors. If there's raccoons on your roof, they're probably accessing a den nearby. So someone should, find something and resolve it before it becomes a bigger problem. Addressing the den should address the latrine where the raccoons are pooping on your balcony. If your roof is accessible by a tree limb that overhangs it, you can remove the limb. The raccoons are good climbers, but they're not jumpers like squirrels, so they're not going to jump down too far on your roof. And maybe one thing to consider also is maybe bird spikes on your railing to prevent access. You know what you see for pigeons and whatnot. I would think raccoons would not want to go over that. Sorry. What advice would you give homeowners and arborists who encounter bird nests when they trim hedges or they're trimming trees during nesting season? Well, so the first thing is bird nests can't be disturbed or destroyed once they're occupied. So once they have eggs under the Migratory Bird Convention Act, which is a federal law. If they're not occupied and they're in a bad spot for you, you can sweep away the nest in the process of being built to prevent egg laying, and the birds will find an alternate spot. That's legal. If it's occupied, you have to let the birds use the nest until the nestling fledge, unless you want to apply for a federal permit. To help successful nesting, just keep your distance, and really that's the best distance is to go by the behavioral response to your presence. So if the bird is showing alarm behaviors or flying off, you've gotten too close, but obviously just be reasonable with that. What advice would you give homeowners who have skunks and raccoons digging in their gardens for grubs? So the grubs are going to be a major food source. So if you don't want the digging, you're going to have to get rid of the grubs. I don't know a lot about grub treatments, but grubs are a really, really good source. They're like some ridiculous amount of percentage fat. So, as long as they're there, they're going to keep being dug up by the raccoons. They're very nutritious. What advice would you give people feeding birds who see chipmunks, rats, and squirrels around their feeders? So you're going to have to clean up more if you don't want those critters around, and maybe get, there's different feeder designs, feeders that are cleaner to avoid the issues. Realistically, cleaning up a bird feeder is a pretty hard regimen to keep up, to keep it clean enough that, you're not attracting rodents. In the case of rats, if you have rats around, I would stop feeding the birds altogether. An unnamed friend of mine had an issue with rats that began with rats at their feeders and turned into rats in their washroom cabinets in a short order. It might be time to stop the bird feeding for a while to avoid real issues with rats. So what advice would you give to homeowners who see free roaming cats in their yard, particularly those who feed birds? So cats under your feeder, which I guess you're seeing as not a good thing. Unfortunately, we can't really control what other people do. So I would say the question I would ask you is, do you need to attract birds and create a situation where they are vulnerable to that cat? That's up to you, ultimately. So I don't know if we have any, I can't see if we had any more questions come into the chat. Those are the questions you guys had submitted ahead of the webinar. I can't see the chat. Okay. Okay. So there's a question or a comment about that I didn't mention groundhogs, squirrels, or foxes. I did go over small mammals, which it did include groundhogs and squirrels, at least in my mind. Yeah, I mean, for groundhogs in your vegetable patch, that's you're probably going to just have to erect some kind of barrier fencing to keep them out. I mean, because your vegetable patch is food, so they're going to want to get into it. That's probably just going to have to be an investment in your garden to build good barriers. Chasing them with a broom is a very temporary solution if you're not out there most times. Yeah, and I mean, as far as foxes eating squirrels, that's what they do. That's what foxes should be eating and should be doing naturally. So I don't see that as a problem. It might be a little unsightly to you, but that's a fox carrying out a very natural process for it, which is providing food by hunting. So that's not a problem in my mind. So if that's the only question, okay, that is the only question. That's great. I'll pass it back to Councillor King. Thank you guys for listening. I apologize. I struggled that time between the French and the English. I think I covered it off mostly, but that was my first attempt at a fully bilingual back and forth presentation. So I think I didn't do too bad. Anyways, so I'll let Councillor King give the send off.
Well, thank you so much, Dom, for this comprehensive presentation, both in English and French. That's very much appreciated by many residents, many constituents in Rideau-Rockcliffe ward. So we're really appreciative that you did that. And I also want to thank everyone who joined us this evening and for sharing the many questions and comments we received in advance and during the presentation. There are many organizations in the city that residents can connect with to assist with wildlife issues. And I think Dom talked about a number of them, including the Ottawa Carleton Wildlife Center, a nonprofit organization which has been helping people coexist with nature for more than 30 years. The center offers education and outreach programs for all ages. It works with residents and community organizations to protect habitat and wildlife and provides tools for residents to resolve human-wildlife conflicts in a humane and cost-effective manner. More information is available on their website, which is wildlifeinfo.ca. For assistance with birds in need of care, there is the Ottawa Valley Wild Bird Care Center, as well as Safe Wings Ottawa. For wild animals in need of care, there's Holly Havens Wildlife Rescue, the Rideau Valley Wildlife Sanctuary, Caitlin's Critters Wildlife Orphanage, as well as My Wildlife Rescue for cottontail rabbits and hares. As always, and as Dom pointed out numerous times in the presentation, you can always call the City of Ottawa at 311 for guidance and resources. And as a reminder, a recording of tonight's presentation will be posted to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/Rawlson King. The recording link and Dom's presentation will also be featured on my website and in my newsletter so that residents can have an opportunity to view the information and resources at any time. Once again, I really want to thank you, the residents, for joining us so much. And I also want to really express my thanks to Dom for giving such an in-depth presentation and for his work at the city around wildlife. I think it's making a difference in terms of education, especially for many of our residents. Dom has been in the community, has attended community association meetings, and we thank him once again for taking time out of his evening to provide you some very high quality information about wildlife in the city of Ottawa. So I wish you a good night and thank you so much for joining us this evening.